Good afternoon. Hope you've had a pleasant enough and enjoyable enough afternoon. And I sincerely appreciate you coming back tonight. We're going to return to Joshua. If you remember, we started this month looking at some of the memorials that are found in the book of Joshua. And we're going to go back and we're going to finish up that particular lesson after a short break for a lot of different things. So in Joshua, these stones are set up, these memorial stones, whatever they are, a giant pile of stones, are set up as a means to remember. And they are meant to remember a whole lot of things. But as such, they are totally impartial, as if follow me, all right? Metaphorically speaking, as if stones had feelings. They would be an impartial judge, not able to pick left or right or best friends or enemies. They are constant in the fact that they don't change and that they remain for generations. So we return to Joshua, and we're going to pick up in chapter 10, if you want to flip to chapter 10, and we're going to look at the next memorial that we see in chapter 10. Now, if you remember the setting, the sequence of events that has happened here in Joshua chapter 10 is nothing shy of extraordinary. This is a series of events that it can only be explained as a God thing. Miraculous, divine intervention, however you want to put it, this is the hand of God. Now, if you remember, a group of kings, 5 kings, set out to conquer the Israelites as the Israelites began to move and conquer the land of Canaan that was promised to them. So 5 kings came and they set out to destroy, to wipe out the Israelites. They created a sort of an alliance. And as luck would have it, Joshua and the forces routed them. And as luck would have it, the sun began to set on this particular battle. And God heard the prayer of Joshua, and the sun stood still. And as luck would have it, we see verse 14. There has been no day like it before or since when the Lord heeded the voice of a man, for the Lord fought for Israel. Simply incredible. And let's not forget, perhaps the greatest part of this battle, the greatest fighter in this battle, is those hailstones, you remember. Those giant hailstones, and it says that there were more people that fell from the hail than there were that fell by the sword. Undoubtedly, God fought for Israel. Well, in that series, in that sequence of events, these kings, they gathered in a cave and they hid themselves in this particular cave. But Joshua gave a command to throw large stones up against the cave so that they wouldn't be able to escape. So we pick up our story in verse 22, and it reads like this. Then Joshua said, "Open the mouth of the cave and bring those 5 kings out to me from the cave." And they did so in verse 23 and brought those 5 kings out to him from the cave: the king of Jerusalem, the king of Hebron, the king of Jarmuth, the king of Lachish, the king of Eglon. And in verse 23, when they brought those kings out to Joshua, Joshua summoned all the men of Israel and said to the chiefs of the men of war who had gone with him, "Come near, put your feet on their necks, on the necks of these kings." Then they came near and put their feet on their necks. In verse 25, Joshua said to them, "Do not be afraid or dismayed. Be strong and courageous." Now that might sound a little familiar, doesn't it? Flip back to chapter 1, verse 6, verse 7, verse 9. Be strong and courageous. Don't be discouraged. For thus the Lord will do to all your enemies against whom you fight. And afterward Joshua struck them and put them to death, and he hanged them on 5 trees. And they hung on the trees until evening. But at the time of the going down of the sun, Joshua commanded that, and they took them down from the trees and threw them into the cave where they had hidden themselves, and they set large stones against the mouth of the cave, which remain to this very day. Now, obviously, we understand that they remain there to this day, not the day that we're reading it, but the day that it was written, right? We understand that. This was, in some sort of way, a very rudimentary memorial as the bodies of these kings were stacked in the cave and the stones stacked in front of it. And it was set there to remember as a memorial. To remember, obviously, as we think about this sequence of events, to remember that God shows no partiality. It was the men in war, and here we've got the kings, that God shows no partiality between any man. Any man that stands against God, it doesn't matter if you're a king, and it doesn't matter if you're just a petty warrior. God shows no partiality. If you stand against God, God will win every single time. It also stands as a remembrance that you can hide, that you can escape, you can flee from battle, but at the end of the day, you cannot escape God. You can't escape the judgment of God. I would think it would be safe to assume that they ran to the caves so that they could escape. But obviously, when it comes to judgment, we know that none of us can escape. When it comes time to answering for the things that we've done, you can't escape from God. And it's also at least ironic in my mind that the place where they sought refuge, where they sought some type of relief from battle this very long day, that's where they died. That's where they rested. That's where their bodies rested. I think there's a connection when we think about the end of our life, that where we find refuge, that where we find rest from this life or peace or whatever, that's where we will find our eternal resting place. So if we find our peace, or if we find our refuge from this life in the things of this world, guess what? We're going to burn up just like the things of this world. But if we find our refuge, if we find our escape in God, well, guess what? The same thing is true, that we will rest with God. They sought refuge in the cave, and they came to rest in the cave. But if we find refuge in God, obviously, then we will find refuge on Judgment Day with God. So this is the first. The first of this memorial stones is the grave, the cave of the kings, these 5 particular kings that fought against Israel. And then we turn to the third to the last chapter in Joshua chapter 22, and we find this very, very significant story in Israelite history. It's the Almost War. Now, if you remember, the Israelites, they have divided themselves, 2.5 tribes on one side of the Jordan River and the other tribes on the other side of the river. So you've got 9.5 over here, 2.5 over here, Manasseh split in half. So as they defeat the land, we come to the end of the book of Joshua, as they conquer the land, everything that they were supposed to do, or at least in part, the 2.5 tribes have fulfilled their promise that they have gone with their brothers and conquered the land. So they return home with the blessing of Joshua. And as they return home, they cross over the Jordan and they make this decision to set up what is called the altar of witness. So we pick up in Joshua chapter 22, and I believe we're going to read the very last verse in Joshua chapter 22 in verse 34. The people of Reuben and the people of Gad, and also Manasseh, called the altar Witness. For they said, it is a witness between us that the Lord is God. Now, if you remember, what they set up was this altar as a exact to the best of their understanding and an exact replica of the altar that they worshiped in the chosen place of God, where the Ark of the Covenant was. So what in the mind of the 9.5 tribes, in their mind, what they have done is they have chosen this place on this side of the Jordan River to worship God. Hence, we almost go to war. But this altar of witness, if you will, this altar of witness was set up to remember. It was simply there as the Gadites, the Reubenites, and the half tribe of Manasseh, as they explain. It's simply there for us to remember that we are all people of God. That just because the river separates us, we are God's people too. Read verse 24 with me. This is what they say. No, but we did it from fear, that in time to come your children might say to our children, what have you to do with the Lord, the God of Israel? It was to remember. We serve the same God. Look at this altar. It's just like the altar that you worship on. We worship the same God as you. We are God's people. And it's also as a way to remember this is the proper way to worship God. It reminds us that even though we're divided, even though there's a river between us, we are still the same people. We are the people of God. And it's set up to remind us this is the way that we ought to worship God, proper worship. And if you look at verse 29, it's kind of interesting at what it says here. Far be it from us that we should rebel against the Lord and turn away this day from following the Lord by building an altar for burnt offering, grain offering, or sacrifice other than the altar of the Lord our God that stands before his tabernacle. That is where we will worship. In the presence of God, the tabernacle, the Ark of the Covenant, that's where God is. This is simply here to remember proper worship. Far be it from us. They see if we worship here, this would be a rebellion, it says, against the Lord. It will be a turning away from the Lord. That's not what this was for. It was simply to remember. And of course, intrinsic in this whole idea, and the very fact that we've had the defeat of, in recent history, of Sihon and Og before we came into the land of Canaan, which is where the Reubenites and the Gadites and the half-tribe of Manasseh were. It's to remember that God fulfills his promises. Because God said, if you go with your brothers, you can return to this land. But think about it. They are in the promised land. It is, we call it the promised land. God is faithful to his promise. So this is a way, this altar, it's a way to remember that God is faithful to his promise. If you remain faithful to God, if you hold fast to his covenant, right? There is a faithfulness, his faithfulness, that will follow you all the days of your life. And here it is. God is faithful. This is a reminder that God fulfills his promises. Here we are, hundreds of years after Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Joseph, and God is finally proven it. God is faithful. God is faithful to his promises. The altar of witness from the almost war. Another reminder how often we need to be reminded. I want to take a little bit of time as we look at this next one. This is if that's the altar of witness, this is the altar to serve. In the last chapter, in chapter 24, the altar to serve God. I want to take a little time here and read. I'm actually going to read verse 16 through verse 24. So just follow along if you're able to. Then the people answered, as Joshua charged them, and he gathered the people of Israel, and he said, choose this day whom you're going to serve. Our favorite text, as for me and my house, we will serve the Lord. Verse 16, the people answered, far be it from us that we should forsake the Lord to serve other gods. For it is the Lord our God who brought us and our fathers up from the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery, who did these great signs in our sight and preserved us all the way that we went, and among all the people through whom we passed. And the Lord drove out before us all the peoples, the Amorites who lived in the land. Therefore, we also will serve the Lord, for he is our God. But Joshua said to the people, you are not able to serve the Lord, for he is a holy God. He is a jealous God. He will not forgive your transgressions or your sins. If you forsake the Lord and serve foreign gods, then he will turn and do you harm and consume you after having done you good. Then the people said to Joshua, no, but we will serve the Lord. Then Joshua said to the people, you are witnesses against yourselves that you have chosen the Lord to serve him. And they said, we are witnesses. And he said, then put away the foreign gods that are among you and incline your heart to the Lord, the God of Israel. And the people said to Joshua, the Lord our God we will serve, and his voice we will obey. Then in verse 26 and verse 27 is where we see this memorial set up. And Joshua wrote these words in the book of the law of God, and he took a large stone and set it up there under the terebinth that was by the sanctuary of the Lord. And Joshua said to all the people, behold, this stone shall be a witness against us, for it has heard all the words of the Lord that he has spoke to us. Therefore it shall be a witness against you, lest you deal falsely with your God. This particular stone, the altar or the memorial to serve the Lord. It was there. It was set up to remind them that they need to serve the Lord. Now, if you back up, this stone, it reminded them that, yes, they were going to serve the Lord, but they made the choice to do it. They weren't coerced into it. They weren't cornered into it, or they weren't tricked into it. You made the choice. Verse 24. The Lord our God we will serve, and his voice we will obey. And it's almost like as you read 16 through 24, 25, it's almost like Joshua's trying to talk them out of it. I don't think you're able to. I don't think you can. I don't think you're faithful enough. I know your fathers. But they made the choice. Listen, you can try to live a Christian life because your grandparents were Christians. And you can try to live the Christian life because one of your good friends is a Christian. You can try to live a Christian life because someone tricked you to come to church one day. But at the end, it's your choice. Nobody can make you be a Christian. Nobody can make you act or think like a Christian. It's your choice, and it's completely up to you. It was their choice. It was to remind them that they made the choice, and now they have chosen to put away all the foreign gods, because that's what happens, or is said to happen in verse 16. Then the people answered, far be it from us that we should forsake the Lord to serve other gods. And again in verse 23, look at it again. It says this, and he said, then put away the foreign gods that are among you and incline your heart to the Lord, the God of Israel. Boy, is there a lesson in there for us. It's easy to say, I want to serve God. I want to be faithful to God. That's easy to say, and words are cheap, aren't they? But it's another thing entirely to be willing to get rid of things from our life in order to serve God. Are we willing to get rid of the things that are a hindrance to our relationship to God? Are we willing to sacrifice anything to serve God? Get rid of the foreign gods and incline your heart to serve Him. Then, of course, you're getting rid of these gods. But then in verse 18, it's elaborated just a little bit. And again, in verse 21, that you should serve the Lord, that you should serve God. Verse 18, and the Lord drove out before us all the peoples, the Amorites who lived in the land. Therefore, we also will serve the Lord, for He is our God. And in verse 21, again, and the people said to Joshua, no, but we will serve the Lord. In fact, if you back all the way up to verse 14, this particular passage is saturated with this idea of serving God. Follow me. 14, serve, served, serve, 3 times in verse 14. Verse 15, serve, served, serve, 3 times in verse 15. Verse 16, serve. Verse 18, serve. 19, serve. 20, serve. 21, serve. 22, serve. 24, serve. Serve, 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 serve. Serve God. What's the image? What's the picture that comes to your mind when you think about serving God? Because sometimes, if I'm honest with myself, I find myself leaning towards the tendency to allow God to serve me. Right? I want God to serve me. I want the Almighty. And it's an absurd idea, isn't it? To have God serve you. But I find it easiest in my prayers. That's where it's the most obvious to me. Because I find myself praying for me and my situations and the things that matter to me and all my to serve God means that it's not about me and I'm not the one in charge. Which brings us to this last one. It was there, this witness. It was there to remind them that you have owned God, that you have made God your God. For instance, at the end of verse 18, therefore, we also will serve the Lord, for He is our God. He is our God. Verse 24, and the people said to Joshua, the Lord our God we will serve, and His voice we will obey. Our God, my God. Do you see the relationship there? Do you see the movement, if you will, from, yeah, that's the God that we want to serve, and to, that's my God that I'm going to serve. In Galatians chapter 4, there's a verse that I'm reminded of in Galatians chapter 4 and verse 9. Actually, let's back up to verse 8. Formerly, when you did not know God, you were enslaved to those that by nature are not God's. But now that you have come to know God, that's one thing. To know God. Who is God? Well, God is the one that has brought us all the way from Egypt, has conquered this land. God is the one that has gone before us. That is God. But now that you have come to know God, here's the second part of the verse. Or rather, to be known by God. So it's one thing that I know God, that God is the ruler, the divine conqueror in Joshua. He is the one that has delivered over and over again when the odds are completely against us. That is God. But now the relationship is reciprocated. To be known by God. I know God, but now God knows me. That is something entirely different. That is an intimate and personal relationship that you can have with God, that He offers to us if we want it. But now that you have come to know God, or rather to be known by God, how can you turn back again to the weak and worthless elementary principles of the world whose slaves you want to be once more? The image is this when we combine it with this context in Joshua. We have been delivered from Egypt, right? We have been in slavery, enslaved to sin. We have been delivered by God out of bondage. And now we have been victorious in the promised land that He has given us. But you know what? Egypt was pretty nice. How about we all go back? That's essentially the gist. Why would you turn back to a life of sin after you have tasted the promised land? Is God your God? Do you know God? Does God know you? Or will He say on Judgment Day, "Depart from me, I never knew you"? It's important for us to remember. It's important for us to remember that one day we will stand before Him and we will give an answer. What will He say to you? That's the question for you. If you need to come to the Lord, please do so as we stand and sing.